Hello, and welcome to Making Known the Unknown. I'm your host, Tina Tarek, and with me today is Sydney Schwartz, teacher and mediumistic Bible researcher, also co-author of the book, My First Encounter with an Angel, as well as Reverend Carl Hewitt, medium, pastor, and founder of Gifts of the Spirit Church. Welcome back.
Nice to be back again.
Thank you. As you remember last time, we were discussing the soul, where it came from, what it means, the function of the soul. In this show, The Soul Part 2, we will be discussing information that had come up in the last show, which was about the soul splitting. And originally the soul, if I'm correct, was one gender, and at some point it broke off to create two genders. And to take it from here, I will ask Sydney Schwartz to elaborate on what he has found with respect to soul and genders in his research.
Thank you, Tina. The story I have to tell goes back to when I was a young boy and I went to the synagogue every Saturday morning. And it got to the point where they were starting the Bible all over again, starting back at Genesis, and we were reading about when God created Adam and Eve. And the rabbi at that point, he would always talk to us about explaining what the Bible actually meant and different interpretations and things. And he explained to us that there was a Jewish scholar called Rashi. And he looked at the wording of the story of Adam and Eve and saw something totally different than most people. He explained that that really the word that's used in Hebrew that gets translated into rib in the King James Bible, where it said that God took a rib out of Adam, doesn't really have to mean rib. It can mean side. And in my research, I found out the only place in the Bible where this particular Hebrew word is translated as rib is in Genesis with the story of Adam and Eve. Every other time, it means side. And he said that what happened is that initially, when the universe was created, all souls were created, and they were both male and female. So that when Adam was first formed, he was androgynous. He was both male and female. But they decided that God decided that wasn't good, and he put Adam to sleep, and he separated the female side from the male, and therefore there was then male and female. It's interesting that in the New Testament, the Christians took that story of Adam and Eve and said that since Adam was made first, that women had to be subordinate to men. And that's why, and they also claimed that women couldn't talk in churches because they had to be subordinate. Well, the real reason for that was that women were a lot more psychic, they're a lot more intuitive. Everybody has heard of women's intuition. And it's very true that women are more sensitive than men are to the vibrations of the spirit world and the impressions of spirit. So therefore, the church leaders were afraid of the women because women could easily go into trance. And in fact, it's recently been told to me that they passed a law. All this is described in the 14th chapter of the 1 Corinthians, where it says that women are not. It is shameful for a woman to speak in a church, and if she wants to learn anything, she should ask her husband at home. The husband had to accompany the woman to church, and you know how it is sometimes. I know it was when I used to go to the synagogue that you're there and you're hearing the service go on in a foreign language that you don't really understand, and sometimes you get a little bored and your mind wanders. Well, in that process for a woman, it's very easy for her to drift off far enough that another spirit could take over her body and entrance her. Just like this is what happens whenever Hewitt goes into trance and Awan speaks to me. He allows his his spirit to drift off, and another one comes in, and Awan comes in to speak to me. So the church leaders made a law that the husband had to sit next to the wife, because if she was to begin to speak, he actually had to muzzle her and stifle her, put the hand over the mouth in order to stop her from speaking, because that entranced spirit might and probably would say something that would contradict church doctrine, and they didn't want to cause any questions.
Now, I myself, like many people, have been to church, have been to Greek Orthodox churches, for example, where I was visiting with a friend and had to sit separately from the men in that group, and I
Right.
never understood that. And you're saying that this is because women seem to be more intuitive, and so then my next question would be, how could that be perceived as a threat? Wouldn't the church or the priest say, look at this intuitive woman we have here. Can't she help us? Can't we work together?
Initially, they were. And when Christianity first came about in the first 200 years of it, there was a lot of mediums that worked in the church. But then in the late 200s and early 300s, at 325 at the Council of Nicaea, it was formalized that mediums could no longer work in churches. And that's when because they wanted to make the priest in the intermediary between God and the people as opposed to the mediums.
Let me add, when Jesus came to the world, he was watching what was going on this planet because he was already in another dimension. He was watching what was going on this planet, and he decided to come back and see if he could teach the ignorant people here, because it was all of these different religions. Every priest had his followers, and the followers kept him in a nice lifestyle. That's all there was to it. And because the priest would preach to their people not to associate with the other people. This is why down through the ages, the different nationalities were forbidden to marry one another, you see? That's all it was. So he came to the world as a teacher. There were others that came before him. He came as a teacher, as a way shower, as a brother to all of us. And when he came, he tried his best to explain to the people and teach the people the gifts of the Spirit. And so he kept demonstrating the phenomena which was called miracles. And when it came time for him to teach the sciences of the gifts of the Spirit, they silenced him before he got into that. This is why he chose Saul as his medium to continue teaching this. But religions throughout the world have hidden this. They don't want people to know it. They really don't. And religions were made by man. Jesus did not teach a religion. And yet there are approximately 12,000 religions on this planet today. And they're still not teaching what he really taught. I was brought up in the Baptist church, and it took me a long time to understand that there was nothing wrong with me. I was hearing voices in the church, seeing visions, and even my parents, I got to the point I was thinking they were lying to me because they could not hear the voices I was hearing. They could not see the people I was talking to. And I had to meet my first medium to know that there was another person like that on the planet. So it's been a complete searching for me. So what we're discussing here tonight is wonderful, but a person has to have an open mind to understand it.
I can see that. Now, the issue of women not being acknowledged for their gifts as mediums, or mediums in general not being acknowledged, I found that there was a little bit of a connection there with the book that you have both written, in the sense that I didn't find too many passages referred to with women who were mediumistic. And if I did, it seemed to be in a derogatory sense. Can you shed some light on that?
Well, excuse me. First of all, if you go back to the history of Greece, a lot of people are aware of this. It was a place called Oracle of Delphi. Delphi was the name of the place. We went there one year to investigate this because he's a researcher and he won't take anything from any of these entities speaking through me. He wants to go there and see it and touch it and taste it, smell it himself. So, and he's also a photographer and a great one at that. So we went over there. We went to Delphi. That was a school of ancient wisdom. There's another place that we went to also that
It's
we
called
visited.
Dodona. It's in the northwestern part of Greece, Dodona.
And there's several of them in Mexico, Chichen Itza. I'm sure some of your viewers will be watching here. And they've been to Chichen Itza in Mexico. That was a school of ancient wisdom. There's always a pyramid in those places. And you go down in Central America, what's the name of that place?
Tikal
Tikal.
in Guatemala.
And Guatemala, and way into the forests. And that was the school of ancient wisdom. They're all over the planet, really. But very few people know what went on there, you see? But there were mostly women way, way back, because men were not sensitive enough to pick up the vibrations, hear the voices, see the visions. And it really takes a person that's sensitive to do this.
To go back to what you were talking about as far as the Bible goes, you're right. There are a few prophetesses mentioned in the Bible. Huldah was one of them, she was consulted when Hilkiah, the priest, found this scroll, which ended up being the Book of Deuteronomy in the temple, and wanted to know if it was legitimate or not. And she basically said it wasn't, but it's got put into the Bible anyhow. The other person that is mentioned a lot is the medium of Endor. And now in the story, in the 28th chapter, the first book of Samuel, her name's not mentioned in there at all. But in the Legends of the Jews, written by Louis Ginsberg, he must have done a lot of research himself, and he found out that her name was Zephaniah. But see, it's not recorded in the Bible, and they did that on purpose because they wanted to depersonalize this medium and make her as scary as possible. Because some Bible commentators, like Moffat, called her a witch in the text of the Bible. And if you could read the Hebrew, you would find out that the word for witch is koshaf, and Bahal Asov is the word that they use, which is a person who has an ov, which is an ancestral spirit. And those two words have nothing in common. And so that is definitely, when they call Zephaniah a witch, it's definitely a mistranslation. But yet, lots of Bibles talk about the witch of Endor all the time. But not too many of them actually put it in the text, because that's really not doing a good job in translation. But because they use that word witch with all its medieval connotations, negative connotations, they're kind of saying that this is something that you shouldn't really do. You know, they're trying to get people to be afraid of mediumship as much as they could.
What you're saying is, from the translations that you have read, some Bibles might not use the word witch. They might actually interchange it with medium or someone who possesses
One with a
those
familiar
gifts.
spirit in
Oh.
many cases.
Yes.
Okay.
I've researched 130 Old Testaments, because that's how many there are, and over 250 Bibles altogether. Some of them are just New Testament, some are just Old, and some are both. So the wording in certain places can vary from quite a bit.
So now, you were mentioning a few words that were unfamiliar to me, or it seemed like a different language. Do you actually read, I'm assuming this is Hebrew?
Yes.
That you're referring to?
I can read Hebrew. See, it was important for me to learn how to say the prayer, so I'm able to read it, but I can't translate it. But I've gotten dictionaries and concordances and interlinear Bibles, which help me translate the Hebrew words.
So were some of the original Bibles in Hebrew?
The Old Testament, the original
Old
language
Testament.
for the Old Testament is Hebrew.
Okay.
The original language for the New Testament is Greek.
And we're sort of jumping around a little bit. You were referring to Adam and Eve, and how the way they were described was very different in many different Bibles. And from what I've understood with just the nature of how you've researched the different Bibles, why should we believe the story of Adam and Eve exists if there's so much contradiction that's going on between the different Bibles?
A lot of people think that anything before Abraham in the Bible is myth. They say they needed a place to start. If you compared, I used to teach a course in ancient history in the public school that I taught in, and I had to teach about the Sumerians. And in the textbook they had the Sumerian story of creation. And if you line up the Sumerian story of creation, they were polytheistic, they believed in many different gods. And if you lined up what that story said, and you lined up the Bible, it is exactly word for word the same, except they had many gods, and the Jewish people had only one God. But the events that took place were exactly the same. So basically, you have to realize that before 586, when the temple was destroyed and the Jews were taken to Babylon, into the captivity, where they met up with the Sumerian culture, the Bible was not a written document. It was all oral history. And it was because the Jewish people wanted to keep their culture alive, and they were afraid of assimilating too much, they decided this was the time to write things down. But where should they begin? So they were familiar at that point with the Sumerian story of creation, so they kind of just borrowed it. It's the same, and changed the names of the gods. It's the same thing with Noah. The Sumerians also have a flood story, but many civilizations do. And it's very similar to the one that's in the Bible, but the names are all different.
Very interesting, thank you. That's brought up another question just about how the Bible was created that we know of today, whether it be the New or the Old Testament that most of us are familiar with. And when I was looking through some of your research, I noticed that there was an event called the Council at Nicaea.
Yes.
And that seemed to be the point at which maybe the Bible that we know of today that's very popular was actually put together. Maybe Carl could speak a little bit about his knowledge in that area.
Well, when the spirit people, the teachers from the other dimensions, when they told me that the New Testament, which is really mostly Jesus' life, was butchered, and the month of June in the year 325 in Council of Nicaea, and it was then, to my understanding, from what they told me, there was like 347 men that were sent there to run this council, which was really to put the do's and don'ts down on scrolls as to how to get this religion going, which was Christianity.
See, what was happening was that Constantine, who was the emperor, wanted to use religion as a unifying force within the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire was over many different cultures, and there wasn't much to tie these people together. So he came to the Christians and said, look, I'll accept Christianity as the main religion, provided that you can come up with a set of rules of how this religion is going to be run, because there were many different branches of the Christian church at this time, and they were disagreeing with each other on many principles. And he said, if you do not come up with a list in a certain amount of time, I'm going to go to this other religion called Mithraism, and I'm going to make that the official religion of the Roman Empire. So all these people ended up going to Nicaea, and they were forced to come up with some sort of rules if they wanted to make their religion the official religion of Rome. And so basically, they were fighting like crazy. They all brought their Bibles with them, and they all had opinions what should go into the New Testament and what should go out, not be in it, and so forth. And it got to the point that they actually were having the fights got so bad that they actually killed several people because they disagreed with them, and they just got rid of them. It was like a bloodbath. We went to Nicaea a year ago right now. We were in Turkey, and we went to Nicaea. And Carl here he got very, very distant, and he walked off by himself, and he was gone for an awful long time because he was being shown all this. He actually witnessed all this in a vision.
They took me back. They took over my body in trance. They took me back to that time. I watched it. And there were 2 men that was murdered simply because they wanted their words and their opinions in the book. And there was a group of other men that would not allow that to happen. And then there were fistfights, and they murdered those. I saw this. It was a terrible experience for me to have that day. And I don't know how long I was gone, but the rest of the people there, my students, they said I had been gone a long time. And the chauffeur of our bus, he was wondering what the heck was the matter with me, because I think he was anxious to move on to some other place. And I stayed in that state for a long time. And sometimes at night I dream about it. I go back to that time, and it's a bad experience.
One of my thoughts, knowing that you are a medium, wouldn't that be a really neat gift to possess? And wouldn't that be a useful tool to help yourself and anybody who comes by? But after you just described this to me, it can be a burden as well, it appears.
I didn't campaign for this. being the 11th child of this Baptist family, I was the only one that was born with the gift of the Spirit. And it has been, I've often said it was a curse, not a gift. But I've had to live with it. So I've had some bad experiences because I wound up realizing I have to teach. This is why this program is being created. The thing is, I ask the viewers to open your mind and think for yourself. So many people don't think for themselves. They've been told, let us do the thinking about it, you see?
Now, thank you. You mentioned the Roman Empire trying to take control of an area of the country, and that representatives from different religions came together.
Different branches of Christianity.
Branches of Christianity.
There were different churches, like Alexandria had its own church, Rome had its own church,
Okay.
Antioch had its own church, and they were pretty much doing different things at that time because Christianity hadn't really settled its regime and doctrine of what it should do, how it should worship, and so forth. There were women priests in those days,
Really?
in some of these churches, giving out the Eucharist. And, but of course that was abandoned after Nicaea. What happened afterwards, after Nicaea happened in 325, towards the end of that century, there was a plan put in place to get rid of mediums altogether. It wasn't good enough that they couldn't be in the church. They didn't want them to be around anymore. So the Pope was Damius I, and he commissioned Jerome to rewrite the Bible, because there had been different versions of the Latin Bible. The Latin Bible wasn't the same in different places. So he wanted a uniform Bible, and he also wanted some of the theology written into the Bible. And so this was Jerome's mission. He did the New Testament and the Old Testament. And because of his mistranslations and ways he stated things, we have certain preconceptions about things down to the present day. For example, a friend of mine who went to Purdue University in the 1970s, and she was Jewish, and when she was out there, some friends of hers, some people she met, got real excited because they had never seen a Jewish person before, and they pulled her aside and they said, I guess they were from the Midwest, and wherever they were from, there weren't too many Jews. And they said, "Would you mind doing us a favor?" And she said, "Sure." She said, "Could you show us your horns?" And she said, "What do you mean?" Well, she said, "All Jewish people have horns." Now, the reason that myth got put into the Bible was because of the way Jerome translated a certain few words. When Moses came down from the mountain with the Ten Commandments in his hands, his auric field his aura was beaming so much. His seventh seal was open, okay, which meant light radiated from here outward, okay? It's like a funnel that's above the head. The outermost portions of that funnel is a little bit denser than the mid part, so it looked like horns. So in the Hebrew it says that there were beams coming from his head, but that Hebrew word that's used for beam is also used for a horn as on a cow. So Jerome simply used the wrong translation and said that he was horned, and because of the theology that came about that the devil had horns. When Christianity created the devil, and they had him be a horned being, then the Jews therefore were worshippers of the devil, as came through in medieval mythology, and this is where this all came from. But it never went away. Here in 1970, we're talking about people still believing this stuff.
So now the devil isn't real. It was simply, what you're saying is a story based on an auric field not being translated correctly.
Well, the horns are. The word Satan is in the Old Testament about 7 or 8 times. I don't remember the exact number, but it means adversary. The real word for Satan is adversary. And as far as it being an evil being, it was only in the Jewish Bible like 3 or 4 times. Because basically what happened was, before that captivity that I was speaking about before, when the Jewish people got to the Babylon, the Zoroastrians that lived nearby, they had a dualistic religion. They had a good God and a bad God. So everything good came from the good God, and everything bad came from the bad God. It was very simple. But the Jews only wanted one God. Now, if you read the book of Job, Job tells his wife that that all good and evil comes both from God. There was no devil. And back to Adam and Eve, it said that God made the tree of knowledge, which was both of good and evil. So God made evil. So this whole notion of putting evil onto a fallen angel, the seeds of it were planted during the captivity. It never really got into Judaism as far as it really blossoming, because the Old Testament was coming to a close. The books came to a close. But by the time Christianity came about, the idea had grown quite a bit, and the Christians ran with it. They just put it way into their theology and everything else.
Thank you. Maybe, Carl, you could tell us.
Allow me to add
Yeah.
this. It was explained to me because I had many questions about, is there such a thing as the devil? They tell me it was created. He said at the time that Jesus went into the desert to confront the devil, he went to confront his own ego. Now let me explain where I come in here. For years, I never thought I was worthy of this. I had a lot of trouble. I was no different than anybody else, and I kept saying that. I had to conquer my own ego before I could realize and accept the fact, all right, I'll do whatever you want me to do. And when I said that, it was like everything lifted from me. I'm still the same person. I came from a poor farm family in the South, but today I want to teach. And there's a lot of people that's coming to listen, because we have to turn within to find the true God, which is the part of us that lives when this physical is dead. It becomes so simple, so simple.
Well, if there really isn't a devil, then I'm assuming there's no hell. But
There is no hell.
What happens when we don't follow the rules of the Ten Commandments? What happens if we sin?
There's different levels of the spirit world. When Jacob had that dream of the ladder, okay, it was representing the different levels, steps of the spirit world. And the lower steps of the spirit world are, quote, the hellish regions, where it's really not a pleasant place to be. So you go up as high on that ladder as you've earned. So if you're going to be a rotten person, you're going to end up in the low rungs of that ladder, and be where all the other rotten people are when you get over to the other side. But if you're a good person, you'll be where the good people are.
Different frequencies, different dimensions.
In my house, there are many dimensions.
That's right. In my Father's house are many dimensions, not mansions.
So then, if we don't lead a, shall I say, kind life, and we're not particularly liked, and we die, or we murder someone, for example.
You go to where all the other murderers go.
Right.
And they all become each other's mirror image. That's where it's all out.
What happens to someone when they are on that level, when they go to that level?
They stay there for God knows how long. I have no idea.
Can a murderer come back? Leading back to the issue of the soul,
Yes,
can a murderer come back?
They can come back, and they'll come back, and they'll turn out to be bad to the rest of life unless they change. They have to change. There's no priest on the planet that can make them change.
See,
I can't make them change. They have to learn to do it themselves.
and if they just want to change and start thinking that they want to change,
Yes.
a spirit from a higher level can come down and talk to them and teach them to bring them up to a higher level of that's called evolution, so they can evolve higher into the spirit
Exactly.
world. But they have to initiate that thought that they want to, or else they can't be rescued.
Okay. Well, that wraps up this episode of The Soul Part 2. Thank you for joining us, Sydney Schwartz and Reverend Carl Hewitt.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us. Until next time.